Hello, everyone. I'm Martell Teasley, Dean of the University of Utah College of Social Work. It is my pleasure to welcome you all today to the college's Grand Challenges for Social Work Speaker Series event titled, What a Drag, Health Disparities Among Diverse Sexual and Gender Identities, Connecting Art and Research. For those unfamiliar with the ideal of the Grand Challenges for Social Work, they are a call to action for our research and practitioners to harness social work's science and knowledge base, collaborate with individuals, community-based organizations, and professionals from all fields and disciplines, and finally, to work together to tackle some of our toughest social problems. As those of you joining us understand, health disparities in the LGBTQ plus community have become one of the most pressing social challenges facing our nation today. It is fitting we take a look at these issues as part of our Grand Challenge series. We owe thanks for today's events to three special groups. One, the B.W. Baston Foundation provided the funding that made it possible for us to explore this important topic. The Castle Foundation also provided critical financial support. We thank both of them. And finally, we are most grateful to our colleagues at Utah Presents for their generous collaboration with this and other events featuring the talented and engaging artist and activist Beatrice Thomas. Before beginning today's presentation, I want to recognize the contributions of our Native American brothers and sisters. We acknowledge this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, and is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, the Paiute, the Gochi, and the Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous people and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationships between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to partnership with Native Americans and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities. Now, our 90-minute event will proceed as follows. We will hear from the College of Social Work faculty member, Dr. Charlie Hoy-Ellis, about his research in this area. Following the presentation, Dr. Hoy-Ellis will be joined by B. Thomas, who performed as Black Benatar in last Friday's Utah Presents performance, Black Benatar, Black Magic Cabaret, and wooed our students with her thoughtful insights in multiple classroom discussions last week. Dr. Hoy-Ellis and B. Thomas look forward to your questions at the question and answer session. Let's get started. Dr. Charlie Hoy-Ellis is an assistant professor here at the College of Social Work. He earned both his MSW and PhD from the University of Washington, where he completed his dissertation project on the mental health of LGBTQ plus adults. Dr. Hoy-Ellis joined the College of Social Work in 2015 and has continued his research on the well-being of midlife and aging LGBTQ plus populations. His research is conducted to help understand and address the social determinants that lead to health disparities, and ultimately for us working together to engage in health equity among marginalized groups. He is co-investigator with the Aging with Pride National Health, Aging and Sexuality Gender Study, and a Geriatric Workforce Enhancement Program fellow at the University of Utah's College of Nursing. Dr. Hoy-Ellis' research has been recognized both nationally and internationally, and he continues to advocate for the well-being of LGBT community and other populations. Welcome, Dr. Hoy-Ellis. Take it away from here.
Thank you, Dean Teasley. I appreciate that very much. And I also want to thank you, Beatrice, for again sharing your presence your knowledge, your art, your performance. My students were so enthralled when you visited our classes last week. So again, thank you. So as Dean Teasley has mentioned, my name is Charlie, and I'm particularly interested in the health disparities among sexual and gender minority populations, also known as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, two-spirit. There's an entire spectrum, and I'm going to talk a little bit about language as I go into it. One of the important things, part of the focus of my research is I'm looking at health outcomes. I started out looking at mental health disparities, and through the course of my dissertation learned that mental health disparities are actually entwined with physical health disparities. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. As I kind of, so I want you to close your eyes. I don't know if you ever played hopscotch as a kid, but at least you have like an image of what a hopscotch chalk on the sidewalk looks like. So you take a couple of steps forward, you skip to the left, skip to the right, a couple of steps forward, skip to the left, skip to the right, and then you finally get to the end, which is actually just the beginning of another game of hopscotch. So hopefully you'll keep that idea of hopscotch in mind as I hopscotch through my presentation today. I will end my part of the presentation with implications for social work practice, as well as our lives as human beings. And then I'm going to turn it over to Beatrice. So Grand Challenges identifies several distinct objectives. So here's a couple of them: ensuring healthy development for youth, closing the health gap, building healthy relationships to end violence, eradicating social isolation, and eliminating racism and systems of oppression. And my argument is that it's these systems of oppression that are kind of shaping why we need to move forward with these grand challenges. So there's this idea of embodiment. So our social experiences get under the skin to result in health disparities. And we see this with racial and ethnic groups, as well as other groups. And so today, the particular group I'm going to be focusing on is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning, etc. I'm also going to talk about why I use and in what context I use the term sexual and gender minorities, which is another way of talking about these populations. So typically we don't want to do spoiler alerts. We don't want to give away the ending, but I'm going to give away the ending and then come back to the beginning. So we know across the lifespan, from adolescence through the end of life, that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender populations experience significant health disparities. So this is a slide from a population-based research that I was part of a few years ago, actually during my dissertation. And so there's a common myth that older adulthood is depressing, that as we get older, we get more depressed. That's actually a myth. Older adults are among the least depressed population of any age group. So this, in this particular study, we used population-based data to compare lesbian, gay, and bisexual adults age 50 and older to their heterosexual counterparts. And you can see here that among the straight people age 50 and older, about 7% were experiencing significant psychological distress, compared to 25% of lesbian, gay, bisexual adults age 50 and older. So that's like a little bit over 3 times the rate of psychological distress and depression. What we are more recently understanding that in addition to increased rates of mood, anxiety, substance use disorders, and suicidality. Sexual and gender minority populations also compared to cisgender and heterosexual populations experience higher rates of cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, disability, obesity, and asthma. One of the things I want us to keep in mind as we think about this is we typically how do I want to say this? We typically place the cause of these diseases within genetics and individual choices, as opposed to the larger social environment. There are many different factors that go into the development of these different chronic conditions, including mood, anxiety, substance use disorders. But one of the things that all have in common and are a huge, huge contributor is chronic stress. And so I'm going to talk today a little bit about what chronic stress looks like among LGBTQ populations and how that manifests in health disparities. So my previous slide, I was showing disparities in rates of psychological distress. And there is pretty solid research that psychological distress, even at low levels, significantly increases the risk for premature morbidity and mortality. In other words, developing chronic illnesses at an earlier age and dying at an earlier age. I want to also highlight the importance of language and that language matters, and that language is ever evolving, and language is more than the words that we use. So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, this is a cross-cultural psychological hypothesis that says the actual words, the actual vocabulary that we use shapes what and how we think. So an exercise I typically do towards the beginning of classes I teach is ask students to close their eyes, take a deep cleansing breath, and I'm going to use a word, and I want you to just think what automatically comes to your mind. And then I do that a second time using a different word. The first term I use is victim of childhood sexual abuse. And so what comes up with that? And then the second time I do it, I'll say survivor of childhood sexual abuse. So the difference in vocabulary between victim and survivor is always really telling, and that we think and attribute different characteristics to people based on whether we see them as a victim or a survivor. Michel Foucault, French sociologist, did a lot of amazing work. If you haven't read Foucault, I highly recommend it. One of his main theses was that language is the vehicle through which power is conveyed. And we have dominant discourses, so that's power from the top down. But then we also have discourses of resistance, which push back against those dominant discourses. So just for example, I'm going to use two words. So when I was in 5th grade, I was 10 years old, I dreaded Fridays. So we had PE every day, physical exercise, physical activity, whatever the class was. And I hated PE on Fridays because we always played Smear the Queer. And I didn't know what a queer was, but I knew I must be one because I was the one always getting smeared. I don't know if you've ever participated in what we now call dodgeball, but that back then was literally called Smear the Queer. But getting hurt with one of those balls, it hurts. And imagine getting hit 3, 5, 10, 12, 20 times within a 45-minute period. Back then, they called it good old fun. Today, I call it school-sponsored terrorism. Also back then, we used to use the term retarded. That was actually used in the DSM and other dominant discourses. Today we use terms like developmentally delayed, neurotypical, different things like that. So language does evolve, but language also has power. One of the important points that I want to highlight, and I know that Beatrice, you have talked about this in both your visits for the class as well as your performance, is the difference between equality and equity. Yeah, in a perfect world, we'd all be equal, but equality assumes that that the playing field is level and that we all have equal opportunity. Equity recognizes that different social groups experience barriers to equality. And so the idea behind equity is to identify what those barriers are and address those barriers so that everybody is able to achieve the best health, whether that's mental health, physical health, social health, environmental health, to be able to achieve the best health possible. And that's where the social determinants of health comes in, because a health outcome, whether it's depression, cardiovascular disease, whatever, some populations experience higher rates of these health outcomes, not because of their social identity group, but because of the barriers that they have to overcome in order to get to that level playing field that other people may take for granted, members of dominant social groups take for granted. So, going back to language, RuPaul is just, in my pantheon of rock stars along with Beatrice. And one of my favorite quotes by RuPaul is, "We are all born naked. None of us are born wearing any clothes, any outfits, any jewelry, anything else. We're all born naked. Everything else is drag." So when I'm doing, for example, a community presentation, I may use the terms LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. When I'm in my researcher drag, I am moving towards using the term sexual and gender minorities. And the reason for this actually started in 2016. The National Institutes of Health adopted they formally recognized LGBT populations as health disparate populations for the purposes of research. And then they provided what I think is at least reasonable definition. So it includes, but is not limited to, those who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual, transgender, two-spirit, queer, and or intersex, individuals with same-sex or gender attractions or behaviors, and those with differences in sex development. These populations also include those who do not self-identify with one of these terms, but whose sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression or reproductive development is characterized by non-binary constructs of sexual orientation, gender, and or sex. And I just, want to kind of really quickly loop back and thank you, Beatrice, for reminding us last week that the gender binary is a fake. Not that it doesn't exist, but the fact that we see it as a binary is disingenuous. So the reason I'm bringing in the life course perspective, and I'm going to go into more detail here in just a moment. So a life course perspective tells us that what we are experiencing today is in large part socially determined by our social and cultural context and time. And by time, I mean not just individual time, but generational time and historical time, and the age at which we are when we experience particular individual, generational, or historical events. So Glenn Elder, back in the 1970s, 1980s got interested in how people experienced the Great Depression of the 1930s, and how if you're 5 years old experiencing the Great Depression, your experience of that is going to be different than if you're 15 or 25 or 45 or 65. And that the past influences the present, which includes health. And the reason I want to point this out is that although my particular area of research focus is LGBTQ / SGM midlife and older adults, today's young LGBTQ midlife, LGBTQ / SGM people are tomorrow's older adults. And what they're experiencing today is putting them on specific health trajectories that are likely not going to show up for 10, 20, 30 years from now. So the kid with the glasses, that's me when I was 7 years old. That was the day I got my first pair of eyeglasses. And there was an event that happened when I was 7 years old that told me I was different than other boys my age. I didn't know what that was or how it was. I didn't have the language for it, but I knew I was different. Right before I turned 14, I figured out what that difference was. So when I mentioned earlier, when I was in the 5th grade, when I was 10 years old, I didn't know what a queer was, but I knew I must be one because I was always being targeted during Smear the Queer. Just before I was 14, I learned exactly what a queer was. It was a person who was attracted to people of the same gender. And it's like, okay, it's not that I don't like girls, but there's something about boys. It wasn't until later that I came to learn that I was also a statutory felon until 2003, depending on where I lived. So the first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which was published in 1952, characterized homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disorder. So sociopathic personality disturbance. So just by definition, I had a sociopathic personality disturbance because I'm gay. At that time, so the first known usage of the word homosexual did not appear, at least in the English language, until the late 1800s. With the publication of the first DSM and actually the first 2 editions of the DSM, gender identity was not differentiated from sexual orientation. There's actually a history with the DSM, which kind of, the DSM, if we think about it as a dominant discourse that exists to pathologize people. There's more to it. We need it to communicate with other mental health professionals, with insurance companies, things like that. But it's actually a codification of how and when and what ways we pathologize people. So there's a common myth that in 1973, the DSM removed homosexuality as a mental disorder. That is not true. What it did was reframe a sociopathic personality disturbance as a psychiatric disorder if you were distressed by your sexual orientation. And again, at this time, gender identity had not been differentiated from sexual orientation. So I don't know how many of you identify as heterosexual or straight, but have you ever been distressed about your sexual orientation as a straight person? So in the 1973, what changed was that just because you're gay or homosexual doesn't mean you're mentally disordered. But if you are distressed by being gay, then you are mentally disordered. And that went through some different iterations. It was not until the DSM-3 revised in the 1980s that homosexuality as a mental illness was finally removed. But history doesn't repeat itself. People repeat history. So supposedly well-meaning psychiatrists and psychologists with the publication of the DSM-5 attempted to destigmatize people with variations of gender identity and expression. So in the DSM-5, gender, a non-cisgender identity is not in and of itself a mental disorder. But if you experience distress around the incongruence between your gender identity and your biology, then it is a mental illness. And in order to get treatment, gender affirming treatment, whether it's hormone therapy, surgical procedures, whatever, you actually have to be diagnosed with a mental illness. So this is pretty much paralleling the entire history of the DSM in terms of per se mental illness, only mental illness if causes you distress, but then thinking about the society you live in, how could you not be distressed? And then it's like, well, sorry, our bad, we got it wrong. It's actually not a mental disorder. It's just a natural variation of human experience and expression. So the important point here is that differing sexual orientations, gender identities, and gender expressions, people with these variations, we do experience higher risk for mood, anxiety, substance abuse disorders, suicidality. And it's not because of our sexual orientation or gender identity. It's because of attempting to navigate a social world that highly stigmatizes our sexual orientations and gender identities. So it's not the gender identity or the sexual orientation itself. It's the constant day in, day out stigmatizing of those identities and expressions. So a term that I like to use is cultural gravity. So culture, in a sense, is like gravity. You can't see culture, but you can't escape its effects, and you can certainly see its effects. So the apple falls off the tree, hits you on the head, you don't see gravity, but it's, oh, that's the effect of gravity. Same thing with social stigma. I can't see the stigma, but I can certainly see the effects of the stigma. And it's interesting that the medical field continues to lump diverse gender and sexual identities together, even though lived experiences and medical needs of, for example, transgender individuals are entirely different from the experience and needs of cisgender, lesbian, gay, bisexual individuals. About 1 in 5 sexual and gender minorities, LGBTQ people, are not out to their providers for a number of reasons, ranging from actual experience of discrimination to fear of discrimination, etc. I typically would show this 1 minute and 30-second trailer. This is a film called Southern Comfort, and it's a documentary. It did come out probably 10, 12 years ago, but I still think it's pertinent. It still happens today. I have people say, well, that happened then, it doesn't happen anymore, and that's not true. So this documentary follows the last year of this man's life. And the reason it's the last year of this man's life is that he is dying from ovarian cancer. And the reason he is dying of ovarian cancer, and you may have picked up on, this is a transgender man. He went to 20 different medical providers when he was first diagnosed, and none would see him because they were afraid that other patients in the waiting room would feel uncomfortable. So they just flat out refused to see him. By the time he actually found a provider that would see him, it was too late. His ovarian cancer was no longer treatable. Okay, so kind of bringing this back around. So all of us experience general stressors in life. So unexpected loss of a job, unexpected illness, end of a close relationship, trying to get through school, all these things that the typical person experiences. But queer people, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, sexual and gender minorities, additional experience minority stressors, additional minority stressors. And so these are on top of general stressors. So there's actual as well as anticipated, why did it do that? Discrimination, fear of rejection. I've got a little asterisk there by the term camouflage because this is another example of language evolving. So we used to use the term concealment or hiding in the closet, which in the short term makes you a less visible target for discrimination and victimization. But in the long term, that constant chronic stress of trying to hide who you are and trying to pretend like you're someone you're not is a chronic stressor. And then the internalization of social stigma. So we are all socialized from literally before birth around dominant societal attitudes, beliefs, and stereotypes around different minority groups. Those who are members of a minority group, that internalization that we actually target towards ourselves, we apply that towards ourselves. So chronic stress operates through the hypothalamic pituitary axis, the HPA axis. So it's like that fight or flight syndrome, which from an evolutionary perspective, we developed when we were less socially evolved. So it was in response to lions and tigers and bears. Yeah, we back in the day had to worry about being lunch for lions and tigers and bears, but those were sporadic incidents. But what happens when the actual social environment itself, as opposed to events or characteristics in the environment, but what if the social environment itself becomes a chronic stressor? And so this dysregulates both our physical and our mental functioning and accumulates over time. So this is a conceptual model called the health equity promotion model. And I'm going to walk us backward through this. So I'd say probably the majority, certainly not all, but the majority of social workers are interested in individuals, couples, family therapy, maybe some community work, things like that. But what we're looking at are these health outcomes. So there's physical health outcomes. HIV, obesity, cardiovascular disease, et cetera, as well as mental health outcomes. So depression, suicidality, things like that. So a client comes in having these issues, and our first go-to is these adverse and health promoting pathways. So what does your diet look like? What does your exercise routine look like? Do you engage in unsafe sexual activities, et cetera? We look at social and community networks. We look at psychological factors. So coping norms, expectations. One thing is different among some social identity groups, in particular sexual and gender minorities, is we may be able to manage our identities. That is, I can camouflage myself as a straight person or try to camouflage myself as a straight person, but that takes a psychological toll. And then there's these biological factors. So this, the long-term effects of chronic wear and tear on our bodies. So there was a research done, and it's been done in different ways in different places, but they recruited a group of women between the ages of 45 and 54, and they grouped the women into Black women and white women. and they controlled for all the usual socio-demographic characteristics, so income, education, all of these things that we know have an impact on health outcomes. And what they found biologically through measuring telomeres, which is a genetic marker of actual biological aging, is that same-age Black women, chronologically same-age Black women, were 7 years older biologically than white women, because, and nothing can never be proven. Anyone that tells you it's proven, they're lying to you. But a preponderance of evidence suggests that it is the stress of racism, the chronic stress of racism, that causes these physical bodies to age faster. So when we're working with clients thinking about physical and mental health outcomes, what can you do to influence these physical and mental health outcomes? So these adverse and health promoting pathways, which mediate and moderate structural and individual levels of discrimination, social exclusion, stigma, institutional heterosexism, microaggressions, all of these different things. But your exposure to these multi-level contexts, so these differing levels of social exclusion and stigma, microaggressions, discrimination, are a factor based on your intersectional social positionalities. So I'm a gay man, so I have experienced structural and individual levels of discrimination, but I'm also white and I'm also cisgender. So I probably experience and am exposed to less social exclusion, less social stigma, less discrimination than a Black gay man or a brown lesbian transgender woman. So the more challenged your social locations in terms of your social intersectional social identities is a function of the types and degrees of stressors that you're going to be exposed to, and how those accumulate or don't accumulate over the lifetime. So my MSW is in clinical contextual social work, so I certainly want to understand frequency, duration, onset of symptoms, but I also want to understand structural and individual levels of discrimination, exclusion, things like that. My advanced practicum was at Seattle Counseling Service for sexual minorities. So we primarily served the LGBTQ community. We did serve some straight people. Over the course of the time I was there, about 3, 4, maybe 5 years into the time I was there, it became really clear that a lot of the mental distress that my clients were experiencing was over and above the typical. So it was this internalized heterosexism. It was this being fearful of being discriminated against and victimized, hiding who they were out of fear of rejection and things like that. So probably 4 or 5 years into when I was there, our standardized treatment plans started including dealing with internalized heterosexism, which is not something that we typically in the general mental health therapy population typically don't look at. Really quickly, I want to be mindful of my time here, which looks like I'm actually running over my time. So it's important. So when our client's in front of us, it's not just who they are in front of us, but the entire history that they bring in with them. So until the 1980s, 1990s, and unfortunately into today, homosexuality, gender, transgender identities, differing gender expressions are still considered a sickness. From a legal perspective, there's perversion. People could be arrested just because of holding hands with a person of the same sex. It was actually illegal for quite a while for people of the same sex to dance together in a nightclub or something like that. You see a little newspaper here. So this was a story from the 1957 Tampa Tribune. Police raided a bar in what they called the opening salvo in a war against sex perversion. They arrested 13 women in the nightclub. And the reason that they arrested them was because they were wearing men's clothes and to all appearances appeared to be men. So literally wearing slacks, wearing a suit, wearing a jacket, wearing a tie was the reason these women were arrested. Not only were they arrested, their names and addresses were published in the newspaper. Almost all of them were school teachers. They were all fired from their jobs. And so a lot of them actually had to leave the places where they lived in order to escape the persecution that they experienced for being perverts because they wore men's clothing. So with today's older LGBTQ adults, this is still part of their lived experience. So up until the 1980s, homosexual could be and often were arrested and voluntarily committed and subjected to treatment to cure them. Treatments included lobotomy, castration, injection with camphor, all of these terrible, terrible ways of things. So what happens in the past from a life course perspective continues to operate in our lives today. So what can we do to better understand this and better work with people and actually uphold the core social justice, core social work value of social justice? We definitely can, and I encourage you to ask Google, what can I do about XYZ? One of the most important things, kind of like the foundation, is to educate yourself and others in your social networks. What does your practice setting look like? If I walk into your practice setting, do I see images of straight people? Do I see images of queer people? Do I see images of transgender people? Or do I just see images of straight people? And by the way, probably straight white people. Engage in community events. Every year Pride is a huge thing. And, take your families, take your friends, take yourself, go participate. We can organize at the community level. So there's a lot of challenges. So I was actually surprised just within the last couple of days, the governor of Arkansas vetoed a bill that had been passed by the state house and senate that would have banned medical treatment for transgender youth under the age of 18. So no hormone therapy, no medical therapies, anything else. And so imagine if you're a young transgender person or you have a friend who's transgender and you're hearing that you're not going to be able to get medical care. So the governor actually did veto that, which shocked the heck out of me. But if you're a parent, join your PTA, get involved in these issues at the local level, get involved with local community organizations. And then at a legislative level, at a macro level, when things like these bills, so here within Utah, within the last year, there was a bill that aimed to ban young transgender women from participating in, quote, women's sports. Lots of different arguments, pro and con. But you can, if you're a parent, you can join a PTA and you can have your voice heard. You can contact your representative, write a letter to the editor. We've had several of our MSW and BSW students have letters published in the Salt Lake Tribune about different social justice issues. I'd also encourage you to run for office. Running for office, few, if any of us, are ever going to become president or governor, but there's local boards of education, there's all kinds of different community advisory boards, things like that. So run for office at a local level. You know, earlier when I said, when I walk into your place of practice, do I see myself? Well, if I walk into any of these places of practice, so the United Way, Alzheimer's Association, AARP, different places, I see myself here. I see myself all over the place. That tells me that I can be visible and I can be recognized. If I don't see this, I'm more likely to hide myself, which goes back to that long-term camouflaging of who I am, results in chronic stress, which increases risk for depression, anxiety, cardiovascular disease, all of these different things. I am now going to segue into introducing Beatrice. One of the things that stood out to me last week, Beatrice, thank you, you talked about we can yell and scream at people all we want, and we're not going to change anybody's mind. But when we start sharing stories and start sharing narratives, that is when we can make a difference. We can change hearts, and minds follow hearts. And so I think of this as the art of racing in the rain, that it takes practice. You know, think about going 200 miles an hour around an oval, rain-slicked racetrack. If you have to think about every move that you're doing, you're going to crash. But if you practice enough, it moves beyond thinking into doing. It moves from a science to an art. And the art is the doing of the science, I think. So that said, I'm now pleased to introduce our wonderful guest, Beatrice Thomas. Ms. Thomas is a principal artist of Authentic Arts and Media, where they are the star and creator of Black Benatar's Black Magic Cabaret. As a national multidisciplinary artist, cultural strategist, and social justice drag queen, they focus on uplifting and centering queer, transgender, and people of color's voices, particularly through creating queer-inclusive family programming. Beatrice is a pillar of Drag Queen Story Hour and serves as the director of the San Francisco Bay Area Drag Queen Story Hour group and the leadership team for the national organization, and as a featured drag queen. They also serve on the national board of directors for the Association of Performing Arts Professionals and have been named a Kennedy Center Artist for 2020. Last Friday, Beatrice premiered Black Benatar's Black Magic Cabaret, a theater spectacle that fused elements of local performance, magic, and drag to bring audiences on a journey through race and allyship in the United States. We are thrilled to have Bea here with us today to discuss the connection between their art performance and my research experience. So thank you very, very much, Beatrice. I think you're muted, Beatrice.
Muted. You missed all the wonderful things I was saying about you, Charlie. Let it suffice to say, I loved hearing your research, and I feel like we have some dinners and evenings of talking that are ahead of us. So. Where should we start? Now you're muted.
Yeah, it's like touch typing, not going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, just stay here.
So what are your thoughts in terms of how your art and performance informs some of the research I briefly and really justice to, but then also how might researchers like myself think about using our research to inform art and performance?
I mean, it's happening, right? It's already happening. So one of the things that I just will start right in the middle and then find my way to the edges. But as I was listening to your research, I just got really excited about digging into connecting it to history, because as you were talking, of course, I'm thinking about William Dorsey Swann, who was the first drag queen, first club kid, born into slavery in 1858, and by their early 20s was referring to themselves as the Queen of Drag in Reconstruction era Washington, D.C. So, like, to me, when I start to think about William Dorsey Swann, who was also the first person to be arrested for female impersonation, we start to understand that, you know, Reconstruction, there weren't a lot of rules. Like you said in your show, homosexuality wasn't even a word that you really saw until the 1900s. So the way I see that there's overlap is that we can use art as a lens to look back through the data, right? To enliven the data. It's exciting to hear you name these things that on the, you know, anti-racism training side, we are using very similar content and information. So I will thank you very much. I will definitely be drawing on your research into those spaces, but also there is, you touched on a couple of things, which is the way that language varies. Oops, sorry. That's probably a dog knocking something over. We're just gonna let it happen. But when I think about language, how we have research language, we have language that is about communicating with, you know, people and populations. We have language that is appropriate for anti-racist trainings versus intersectionality is a perfect word that really spans the academic to the very practical areas of understanding. So I think that the overlap really is in creating dialogues and starting to like explore the narratives that are the underpinnings of the research. So exciting. I think that things that just really resonated for me as I was listening is when you started talking about the sort of, I guess comorbidity might not be exactly the right word, but how like my mom was a shrink, so it's a psychiatrist. And so I grew up with a lot of DSM dialogue around the kitchen table. But just thinking about how intersectionality puts these health issues and social stressors, health stressors and social stressors start to interconnect. And I started thinking as a non-binary person married to a trans man, my pregnancy journey is so very layered as also a female-bodied Black person, right? Like, and it was the advocacy piece, the need to, we are not taught how to advocate for ourselves. And there are some people in our, you know, culture that don't have to advocate for themselves. I had to learn about advocating for myself. And so at, you know, in my late 30s, as I'm trying to get pregnant, I am really running into roadblocks because there are a lot of assumptions that people make across in these situations as to if you're really serious about getting pregnant, or what, when they ask, are you actively having penetrative sex? These are things that then characterize the doctor's mind and how they are going to treat you or treat the seriousness of your pursuit. So just listen, there's so much that we can learn when we pair data to stories and to experiences. So I do see, and I also think it sticks more when we start to connect it very through to the narratives, because we do have these charts, and I love that chart you just showed, but you will remember how that chart works if we can start to look at how it impacts in a life or in a day, right? Or in a week. I went to an incredible talk by a woman who I can't remember her name, but I will send you her presentation. She really looked at health disparities in Star Wars. And she looked at, you know, Luke Skywalker as a parent, as a child of a broken home, and like really tracked his journey with these sort of health factors kind of built in. It was very engaging, but it really illuminated into the room how small things can impact over time. My show was really, I felt like we are trying to get to 3.0 in our effort to create a more equitable society. We're trying to get there so fast, and there has to be a way to keep folks moving along. And so for my work, I wanted it to be some kind of a primer, some kind of a place where it was 100% rooted in queerness, in the perspectives of people of color, but also it's an invitation to sit in that space with us, to be outnumbered, or to have the context set differently, because I think that's an experience that can bring us together. It's one that we know very well, being the one or the example, like we are people who have chosen for all intents and purposes to become professional queers, right? To come and move our society forward, to create a vision of equity. I believe that's what I believe. And so in that regard, I wanted to create a space where it doesn't have to be someone like myself who is like, I will stand up and share my stories so that we can together grow, but more like, here's a space for you to come and bring your family, to be able to kind of witness some things, to come away with some questions. Well, why was that a problem? I think that we need pathways for dialogue, and that will be data, and that is also art.
Yeah, thank you for that. There are just so many different images and thoughts and ideas that came up as you were sharing. One that first popped into my mind. So there's a researcher by the name of Sarah Gellert, and she's been interested in breast cancer among women. And so this was a few years back now, but she identified a pocket in Chicago, in one of the Chicago suburbs. And in this neighborhood pocket, there was an extremely high rate of the most malignant form of breast cancer. I think it's the BCRA4, something like that. I apologize for not remembering it. It was about that same time that for the first time, there was some research that suggested that chronic stress is also related to cancer and the risk for cancer. And what they found was that it wasn't the stress that was causing the cancer, but it was the stress that was deactivating a gene that was protecting against cancer. And so they went into these communities and they did what I think was a pretty amazing social determinants of health disparities research project. So they interviewed the individual women, give them the standard psychological tests, things like that. But they also collected biomarkers, so blood pressure, took blood samples, body mass index, different things like that, different measures of stress. But then they also had people literally walk through the neighborhoods and count the number of abandoned homes and count the number of boarded up windows and count the amount of broken glass and discarded hypodermic needles in parks and things like that. And what they found, and this goes back to that embodiment of stress, that bodies tell stories that their owners cannot, will not, or are not allowed to tell. So the women actually reported low levels of stress, but what their biological markers were showing was they had high levels of stress. They just become inoculated to it. It wasn't they weren't experiencing it. They just had gotten used to it.
You live in it. You live in it.
And that seems to be a great example of how like the little ordinary everyday accumulates and stacks up and becomes more and more.
Mm-hmm.
And how these higher levels of systems of oppression, so racism, redlining, all these different things have very real effects.
It is, I think that just the state of becoming aware of, it's like, as you search for liberation, you kind of wake up to new oppressions. You're like, oh, even that. And I think learning that my natural cortisol levels were higher, which makes getting pregnant harder, right? That I have experienced, I'm sorry, my boss is whining at me. Let me just let them out. Get out of here. So sorry. But learning that those cortisol, that was just, that's a natural state, and that impacted my pregnancy, which I waited. I was told it was going to be easy. So I really, this so resonates in terms of the amount of layers. And I think that I'm kind of interested in like the tools that can be shared to help. And I hope my show, kind of did this, but that as social workers, as people who are going out there to service the public's health, right? How do we use inquiry as a tool to avoid assumption, right? That like if we can shift to a practice of asking the questions, or asking questions, not are you experiencing stress, but maybe there are new questions that can triangulate our answers, so in terms of, I think about your research, and I feel that there is this incredible opportunity to look at that research and to compare how we are getting the information currently, and are there new models, are there new questions? Because we know, we're using standard forms for things, and it's why that local level engagement in politics is so important, because you can impact things like the social work system, right, at that local level. And so there is, we are a part of a network, and if we can gauge our activism towards our interest, it becomes easier to build on it,
Well, thank you for that. And I did not know that cortisol was associated with pregnancy planning, so thank you for
the stress. It impedes. It is a fascinating world of intersecting health disparities. It truly is. I could share a couple of very just quick things that were they made a huge impression on me. I married my partner. We've been together about 7 years. They've been transitioned for decades at this point, maybe, or close to 2 decades. But something that still occurs is urinary tract infections in trans or non-binary people because of not feeling safe going to the bathroom, right? So developing superhuman bladders that are actually creating health conditions that can kill you, because of these things. So that is something we always have to think about when we are traveling, when we're going on vacation, when we are going for any kind of experience. We have to think about timing, and if we don't, we can be in a situation. And so that's something that is a privilege that I have enjoyed, because I sit in that non-binary space. And so I would share that. I would share that something about pronouns. I had a really great talk with my parents after watching the show about pronouns. What is that? And why is that important? It's important because it has the ability to set people at ease, right? When you are, I think it's the intention behind that is to see people as they wish to be seen. And that's a wonderful place to start when you're looking to get honest information, right? As when you're looking to engage in research. I'm assuming you did interviews as well as the requisite standard research.
Yeah, absolutely. Just we're going to have many, many, many dinners and many, many discussions because so much of what you share resonates, and it's those small things that we don't think about. So, for example, uh, I'm not really familiar with the research, but I do know that there's research out there that transgender and gender non-binary people, like you said, learn to go the whole day without having to use they have to use the restroom, but they
Mhm.
learn to use the restroom because
Mhm.
you're involved with that, and how not doing that doesn't sound like a big thing. I've done the PP dance a couple of times in my life, but it's not a typical feature of,
Right.
so it's not really going to impact my health.
Mhm.
Something that's a daily feature of my life. It's a small thing, but at what point does a single drop of water become the Pacific Ocean?
Thank you. It's the small things. We're really fighting and I don't want to use the word fight, but we are really trying to solve for the small things. But we're using these big hammers for it in certain cases. It's that the big things are very clear. We can see them coming, right? Usually there are prescribed solutions to them. Like we write the letter, we get a protest, those are the big things. But the things where we have real power is in observing the small things and making small changes that have compounding impacts. So I just see so much. I feel inspired for my next piece, and I look forward to kind of digging into some of the research that you touched on. Trying to think, I had another thing that popped into my head. It fell out, but I'm sure it's going to come back. How long did it take you to put this body of research together? I'm just curious.
um, so my first research paper, so I was a non-traditional student. I dropped out of high school when I was 16, started at community college when I was 38, transferred to a four-year institution. So this would have been 2001, 2002.
Yes.
Took a class in cross-cultural psychology. And that's where I learned about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis that I mentioned earlier. So like many college classes, there's a final research paper. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll write about homosexuality because, hey, I am one, so I know all about it. So I can ace this thing.
Yes.
Oh my God, it took me all of 2 days to start to understand how much I didn't know that I didn't know about
Mm-hmm.
something that I thought I was an expert on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, part of it was, so I'm two of four boys. So I'm the second, the oldest and the youngest were both straight. Myself and the next youngest after me were both gay. When I came out when I was 15, my parents threw me out of the house and he saw how I was treated. So he didn't come out until a few years later.
Mm-hmm.
He came out in the suicide note that he left behind. And so that was when I started to really um, see from a different perspective how this social stigma, the systems of oppression, discrimination, everything
Yes.
impact people's lives and deaths. And so that
Yes.
part of what, as I started going into higher education, it's like, okay, this is the population I want to work with because, hey, maybe there's one person that can see something different or see it in a different way
Mm-hmm.
and maybe won't park that 45 against the roof of their house.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I was in my practice, so in my MSW program, I did this book learning around internalized heterosexism and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. But actually sitting with clients day in and day out and hearing their stories, their narratives, and how they carried that grief and that fear and all too often that hopelessness in their bodies, how that was part of their bodies. It's like, okay, I started to understand how, we tend to blame the individual in individualistic cultures, but then started to see how, wow, it's actually these laws and these policies, and when someone think of the children,
A
how do,
systemic network of oppression, perhaps.
yeah,
You
yeah,
know, I think it's you. So you brought me right back to when you were talking about violence, and I had put in the chat where it's like that the distress that one feels about their identity is not, it doesn't count when it's distress because you are physically concerned for your safety, and that in fact homophobic and racist violence has more markers that connect to a disorder than right the individual. So I find that so telling right there in your narrative, right? That it's, and also I don't know if but your chosen family, that there's often this narrative of when you are not assimilating appropriately, and you have a culture that really values assimilation, you cast folks out, and that in queer community is allowed for people to create chosen families, and these families were actual health networks. It is how people found out about doctors who would serve them. It's how people found out where they could get hormones, where they could get medicines, where, so there is a network that is very rich and social, that connects to it's not just random research, it's that you had to have gay social workers, because those were the ones that were those names traveled in the network, so that because they could relate, they could understand. Anyway, this work that you're doing and that these students are engaged in is so important to know how their edification and their knowledge and their desire to seek out and get the information is going to enrich their ability to contribute. This is all history, but if we're not asking the questions, we won't hear the answers, because we have a web of conformity that keeps certain narratives suppressed. And so if anything, I think the radical doctrine of inquiry, ask,
and that is so important. And I experience it myself to this day, and I'm still trying to figure out how to support students. I know that you have questions, that you have questions, but there's this fear of sounding stupid or hurting someone's feelings or fearing of being attacked. So how do you, we can tell you the magic is when you step outside of your comfort zone, but how do you do that? So for myself, what that experience that I was relating at Seattle Counseling Service is actually, okay, maybe I can do research that will change things at a larger level,
Yes.
and have downstream effect.
Mm-hmm.
And although it is elitist, I recognize in order for my research to be taken seriously, I needed to have that piece of sheepskin, which is why I went back to get my PhD, which has led to all kinds of other things. We do have a question from the audience.
Excellent.
I
Because you can tell we would just keep going on, y'all.
Jelly sandwich. I suspect in both of your professions, you've seen your work create aha moments for students, audiences, professionals, etc. Are there any of those times you might share, times when you've connected to someone, some group, to help them broaden their horizons or change their perspectives?
I mean, I get to have, because I do anti-racism trainings and cultural equity trainings, I get to get feedback very often. I make a point of not asking for immediate feedback, because sometimes it's very challenging experiences. and you need things to settle in. But I think that often the best feedback or aha moments that I have experienced is when someone becomes sort of aware of, they connect their privilege to their agency to change. Like when they start to understand that we do a privilege exercise and people learn where they're socially located and where they have more power. And then there's a flip that I ask people to do, which is to look at your privilege and see where are the tables that you sit at with power, and then figure out how you can enact change in that. And in those moments, those are kind of the aha moments when someone is like, oh, I am the head of this organization and I just said that we needed to start putting gender neutral signs on our restrooms whenever we did a thing. It's those little things, because it starts with something little, and then your eyes just start opening up to seeing where your little actions can happen. So that felt like an aha moment. What about you?
Actually, I do try to use personal stories. So, like I have shared the tragedy of my brother's death by depression. Although the means was a gun, it was depression. Anyway.
Yeah.
But in my classes, especially my reflexive classes, we do these privilege exercises also. And we do them in a couple of different ways. One is just, go through and check the privileges that you have. But one that I find particularly, students have shared with me, they find particularly effective is privileges for sale. So we take a particular privilege checklist and we put students into small groups, and then we give them, I give them different amounts of money. So each privilege costs $100. There's 30 privileges on the checklist. Your group has $200, so you get to buy 2 privileges. Your group has $400, so you get to buy 4 privileges. Your group has $800, so you get to buy 8 privileges.
Okay.
And what was it when you're thinking about, okay, which privileges are you going to buy? What is that process about? What were you thinking? What was the discussion? What was the dialogue like? And it's been really interesting, especially for students who may have more privileged identities or more multiple privileged identities. Wow, I never had to think about access to healthcare in order to be safe, or these things. So it's not just what privileges do you have, but if you didn't have any privilege and you could only buy 2 or 4 or 6, which ones would you buy? And how do you come to that decision? So these are the ones you decided. What was it that led you to decide those privileges? And I see like the light bulbs going off.
On. That's awesome. That's awesome. There's a great, I would say, a compliment to that privilege. And how much time do we have? I don't want to overtake if you need to finish, I want to be respectful.
I think so it's 1:20, we have 10 minutes. I think it'll probably take me about 2 minutes to close out.
Okay.
8 more minutes.
Okay. So I will share a great exercise that I think as a group people find illuminating. But it's sort of like we write down privilege statements. So things that could be answered yes, no, or on a spectrum. And in this new Zoom world, it's not quite the privilege walk, but it's watching people place themselves, say something like, I have never had trouble fitting into an auditorium or airline seat, right? And yes, all the way up here, no, all the way down here, or in your life somewhere in the middle. And we do that with things like, I have never felt endangered holding the hand of my loved one. I have never been afraid to walk home at night. I live in a neighborhood that is very safe, but you're seeing how people, it's not something about in comparison. So nobody's getting left behind, but it's meant to allow you to just wake up into your varying privileges and understand that we all have varying scales of privilege. But when we have a privilege, we have to, our training is to think, what about the person on the other side of that who doesn't have that privilege? That as our internal meter, we have to be aware of what can we do in this world, so that then it allows us to care for the person that maybe doesn't have access to that. That's a really, and that's, it's fun to kind of create what those privilege statements are. Like that's having people even articulate that. And once you get folks going, you know, everyone experiences some sort of privilege or bias. Every single person, you know, in this world, doesn't matter what age, color, race, you will experience bias in some way. So how do we, I want us to be addressing that in a complete way. We have to understand ourselves though, you know?
You know, that reminds me of another activity we do. It's called a culture chest. So precedent to the culture chest, students will first do a personal identity wheel. So, you know, my favorite food, favorite hobby, sister, whatever. Then we do the social identity wheel.
Mm-hmm.
So to kind of help students understand the difference between personal identities versus social identities. And then the culture chest is students take some time and think about it, and they create a container. It can be a cardboard box, a paper bag, you know, any type of container. And on the outside, they put images or objects or words about how they think other people see them. And then inside are 3 objects or words or things like that that people may not see. And I've seen students connect in ways, because it really calls for you to step outside of your comfort zone, especially when you're revealing what's inside. And when one student will share something, it's like another says, oh my God, I thought I was the only one in the world who felt like that. And so it's a way to start connecting outside of that comfort zone.
I remember speaking with your students around that sort of the false belief that we know someone based on, there's that confirmation bias or affinity bias. Like, you look like me, therefore I feel that I know you, and then I will afford you trust. But really, it's all about that, what's inside the box, right? What's outside the box is really only half of the story. And so how do we create mechanisms to see inside the box first before we start to allow our assumptions to dictate the outcomes?
Yeah, and that's important. And it's that opening up our box, opening up ourselves, you know, this is what you see, this is what you don't see, requires bravery, and it requires taking a risk, and that's the basis of trust. You know, if you knew this about me, you wouldn't like me, you'd reject me, but I'm going to take a chance. And what if I find that instead of rejecting me, you're actually embracing me out of that part of myself that I feared sharing?
It's like finding your people in a lot of ways. You're not going to be able to find your people until you open up. It's like, I want everyone to, you know, I want to acknowledge that not everyone will come along, and that equity allows for people to not necessarily come along. It just allows that each people have access to fair and equitable treatment despite their circumstances. So it doesn't, You know, I don't think we're selling, or I'm certainly not selling a happy, you know, a what is it, fairy tale ending. But I do think that the fairy tale is one where no one feels that they can't take a risk in order to find, you know, a truer existence, provided it does not hurt or harm anyone else.
Kind of going back to the whole Star Wars motif, the excuse me, heroic journey motif. Now sometimes life calls on us. We can either answer or not. If we do, it can take us into some really strange places.
Oh my gosh, wonderful places. I can't see who's participating, and that's so hard for me. But I really, if anything, I hope that at least the talk says, if you find something that you're passionate about, pursue it, right? If there's a area of research, pursue it, because the more you do that one specific thing, the more that is what you will be known to do, right? It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and the specificity is of deep value. Your interest is important.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, do what you care about. I think when you were talking last week in one of the classes, it was the small things that are easy that you can do on a regular basis.
Yes. We're looking at the low-hanging fruit, right? We, you know, start easy and frequent.
Yeah. Easy and frequent, and be prepared. I think be prepared for unexpected gifts that can come from that. So, you know, going back to the earlier question, you know, I'm thinking about, and we're almost out of time. So Thanksgiving dinner with the family, woohoo! For some people, that's great. And for others, it's not so great. And Uncle Bob says something homophobic or something like that, and nobody says anything. And what they don't know is that 13-year-old Louise is recognizing she may be lesbian.
Mm-hmm.
The message that she's getting is that there's no one standing up for her.
Right.
But then there's also a counter narrative of the mother who said, well, you know, Bob, you're my brother, and I love you very much, but what you just said was very offensive, and not in this house, because people matter and we love people. So what's the different story? What's the different message that the young person is getting there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, unfortunately, we are about out of time. So I want to thank everyone involved, to our highly respected guests. And I think I'm just going to have the dinners as open-ended. There's never going to be a limit on those, Beatrice Thomas.
No. When I'm coming back, and I'll be vaccinated, so.
For your time here today and for your impactful art and service on these critical issues. We want to thank our generous sponsors, the B.W. Bastian Foundation and the Castle Foundation. So thank you very much. To our colleagues at Utah Presents for their friendly coordination and enthusiastic support of this event. To all of you joining us, and to those who continue to I also want to acknowledge that the College of Social Work is committed to this speaker series as part of our ongoing efforts to address the grand challenges for social work, which are truly grand challenges for our communities. We hope you'll join us in the 2021-2022 academic year as we continue to explore solutions to these important challenges. Please visit the college events page for information on all of our events. That's socialwork.utah.edu/events/. And good afternoon to all of you. Stay safe and have fun. I'm going to go switch my puppies. They've been pawing at me, so I'm going to go have fun switching my puppies. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.